Thank you for joining us in This Week in Turkey. I am Murat Tursan. Tonight, the Lira is in free fall yet again. Main opposition party CHP chair Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and E-party chair Meral Akşener go on a tour of reconciliation, and a tale of 1950s Istanbul takes the world by storm. Our guests tonight are Doctor of Economics Kemal Yılmaz, who will be speaking to us about the most recent financial catastrophe, and columnist Kenan Sharpe answers questions about the recent Netflix hit, The Club. Our main story tonight, the Turkish economy continues to worsen. The Lira is trading at 11-1 against the dollar, 12.5 against 1 against the euro, and skimming 15 on the pound. And at this point, the ruling party appears to have given up on the value of the lira, and President Erdogan focuses solely on reducing interest rates. Now, President doubled down on his low interest rate policy at his party group meeting on Wednesday, triggering an initial rise in the dollar. The dollar peaked the following day when the central bank indeed confirmed that they had reduced the interest rates down 100 basis points. It's uncertain how far the lira will continue to sink at this point, but what is for certain is that there doesn't appear to be any brakes on this train.
The Turkish lira continues to suffer from record devaluation. After passing the milestone 10 to the dollar last week, yesterday saw the lira trade at a record 11-1 against the dollar, as the country's central bank continues to insist on lowering interest rates. Lowering of interest rates, a cornerstone of President Erdogan's economic policy, has been criticized for fueling currency devaluation. The central bank yet again made the controversial decision to reduce interest rates by 100 basis points to 15%, immediately triggering further market upheaval. On Wednesday, a day prior to the decision, President Erdogan had doubled down on his economic policy of reducing interest rates, causing a reactionary spike in the dollar topping out at 10.56. When the decision came down from the central bank the following day, the market closed at 10.94 liras to a dollar, having topped out at 11.24 hours earlier leading up to the announcement. Despite the lira losing 25% of its value this year alone, the central bank appears unfazed. The Central Bank Monetary Policy Committee reported a positive outlook on the economy, stating, "Leading indicators point to a strong course of domestic economic activity, also driven by foreign demand. With the strong upward trends in exports, the improvement in the annualized current account balance is expected to continue in the rest of the year."
Joining me now to comment, Doctor of Economics and Professor at Koç University, Dr. Kemal Yılmaz. Dr. Yılmaz, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, for inviting me.
My absolute pleasure, sir. We were lucky to have been able to get you. Now, Doctor, I want to start off by asking you about the independence of the central bank. Now, in most developed nations, central banks are independent institutions, and in Turkey, theoretically, is also independent, but de facto, it's not really. Whoever resists President Erdogan's economic policies tends to get replaced very quickly, particularly the presidents of the central bank. So, de facto, the Turkish bank is subservient to President Erdogan. Now, can you please explain why central banks are supposed to be independent bodies and what it means for the Turkish economy that the Turkish central bank is in fact not independent?
Thank you very much again for inviting me. As you know, we are going through hard times again, economic hard times, I would call it. Basically, Turkish central bank is de jure in paper, on paper or on theory by law, is independent. It means that it can basically, it can operate by itself without any political influence. What do I mean by that? At the moment, central bank and the government together determines the target inflation rate, which, as you know, 5% for ages now, for almost longer than 10 years, 5% target inflation rate for the end of the year. So the rest of the monetary policy is given, that duty is given to the central bank to basically bring the inflation, whatever rate it is, as you know, it's around 19.9% right now. So all the way down to 5%. So that is, it can use any technical tools. It can use the interest rates, or it can use the policy interest rate, or it can use the reserve requirements that it charges to the banks, and so on. So on paper, this is the case, but as you know, and this is 2001 century, calls it technically independent. But now, in reality, it is not independent because what we see at the moment, especially after the presidential system, President Erdogan basically calls it like, I have the authority to remove the central bank governor. And basically, if the central bank governor does not follow the policy that's prescribed by the government, then a few times the governors were removed. And also lately was that the members of the Monetary Policy Committee were also removed from their jobs. So therefore, in the end, central bank, in effect, is not independent. And that's what we see over the last couple of months, that central bank lowers the interest rate, first 100 basis point in September, 200 basis point in October, another 100 basis points yesterday. And it is likely to lower another 100 basis point next month. So by the end of the year, it's going to bring the inflation, the policy interest rate to 14%, whereas the inflation is around 20%. So in effect, the real interest rate is around -4-5% at the moment. So effectively, central bank says that the credits, especially the commercial credits, are not tracking up. So I want the commercial credits to move up so that investment will continue, investment will increase. That will improve the economic conditions. And as a result, the economy will get out of the impact of the COVID crisis. But nevertheless, we economists don't agree with the central bank, because as the central bank lowers the interest rate, what happens is that the Turkish lira that it prints, it is responsible for in many regards, its currency that it is responsible for, is going into a free fall. So when the policy rate is much lower than the inflation, therefore no one wants to hold that currency. Instead, everyone moves to stronger currencies like dollar and the euros. And as a result, this brings me to your other question, unforeseen side effects and so on. The third question, I guess, you asked. Or have you asked this already?
Not quite yet. Not quite yet. Maybe we'll get back to that.
Maybe I should just stop here, and then I will let. So it's not effectively independent, as we can see, as we are living through.
I see, sir. Now let's move on to the second question. By now, we're all aware that President Erdogan's economic theory is considered unorthodox by most. Now, President Erdogan considers high interest rates as a direct cause of high inflation. Would you say that this is a sound theory? Because thus far, reducing interest rates doesn't seem to have a positive impact on the economy. Your take, please.
So this is not a sound theory, and you cannot see such a relationship in any theory books or in any other books that you can see on economics-related books. And basically, there may be a channel, small channel, like if a firm borrows and invests, and while it's operating its production, then the cost of borrowing, that's the interest rate, could be a burden on the firm, and maybe they will increase their prices to compensate some of these additional, what you call spending on interest. But this is a very minor channel, and if you think about it, maybe you can see this minor channel in the hard currency countries, but not in our country. Why? Because as you lower the interest rate, as in our case, to lower the cost of borrowing for firms, what happens? The Turkish lira depreciates and the dollar gains, euro gains against the Turkish lira. And what happens? The firms that have borrowed in dollars or euros, their debt burden increases further. So as a result, what you try to gain from the lower interest rate, you give much more through the increased foreign exchange borrowings. And therefore, there is no sound, it's an unorthodox. It is not orthodox in the sense, it's not in the books. And basically, the idea of inflation is that it can be demand pull inflation. And demand pull inflation means that if the aggregate demand is increasing, consumption, investment is increasing, then one way to slow down the economy, because as the demand is increasing, prices tend to move up. That generates a little bit upward movement in inflation. So one way to control it is increase the interest rates, increase the cost of borrowing, so that firms and families, they will postpone their spending a little bit, and this will basically lower the pressure on prices, upward pressure on prices, and therefore that will bring down the inflationary pressure lower. But the President Erdogan's theory never mentions anything related to this, and therefore, in that regard, it just focuses on that minor channel which does not apply in our case at all. And in the end, so this is what we are seeing, that's Turkish lira depreciating very fast, and our inflation, which was around 14.6% last year, around 20% or above by the end of this year. And we know that people are crying, shouting, and saying that my inflation is much higher than this official inflation. So therefore, we are going into a high inflation era just because of this, what you call, not sound economic theory in the end.
I see, sir. Just for the folks at home, last month, I believe the Turkish Statistical Institute declared that the inflation barely ticked up, if at all. But people on the street really are decrying that they don't trust those numbers, that the real inflation rate is nowhere near what the Turkish Statistical Institute is claiming. And on that note, while we're on the subject now, of course, there are several very easily understood side effects of the lira losing value against the dollar and consequently against other currencies. For instance, now it's far more expensive to import goods, far more expensive to make foreign investments, etc. And these are things that we're all aware of, but could you list any significant side effects to folks at home, people out on the street, that the devaluation of the lira might have that we may not be aware of?
No, I think the most important side effect is inflation, basically. But the important part here is that one, producer price inflation was already 46% by the end of October. And by this month, by the end of this month, it will move closer to 50% perhaps. So the cost of production is increasing. But the thing is, this is not reflected in the consumer prices. That is one thing that bothers many economists, including myself. And given the fact that the economy is growing around 9%, okay, as Turkish lira depreciates, that increases cost of production because we import an important chunk of our intermediate goods and raw materials from abroad. So the cost of production increases, and then part of this increase should be reflected into basically retail prices. But it doesn't work out that way. That's the reflection is very little so far. Whereas if you go to 1994, for example, the difference between the producer price inflation and the consumer price inflation was around 30%, okay, the highest. But today it's also around like 26%. And the highest was 1994, and today, 2001 crisis, it was higher again. But why was the case? Now, in 94 and 2001, there was no domestic demand. Aggregate demand collapsed because of the crisis. In a crisis period, people consume less, investment dropped significantly. As a result, it makes a lot of sense for the producers not able to reflect the cost of production into higher cost of production into their retail prices. But today, we are growing around 9-10%. The economy is doing great in terms of overall. But it seems like producers cannot reflect the increase in their cost of production to the retail prices. This makes many people more worried about the Turkstats numbers. And in the end, I am worried about the government as well, because think if, let's say by the end of the year, it's 20% is the official inflation. So a person gets 20% pay raise, just to be compensated by the official inflation. But he says, or she says, my inflation is 30%, 40%. So if it is 30%, 35%, let's say, it leads 15% decline in his purchasing power, okay? So he is feeling, or she is feeling poorer, 15%. And let's say next year as well, this is repeated, another 10, 15%. And then in 2023, our centennial, we are going to go into an election. How can a government going into an election basically expect that this person who is suffering, his purchasing power declining, he or she's getting poorer by around 25-30% in 2 years, why should they vote for the government?
Fair enough.
At least if you compare this with 1990s, we had around 60% inflation, but then the pay raise was around 60% as well. So now the situation is even worse.
Fair enough, sir. I think that might be explaining some of the recent political polling that we've been seeing and the fact that the ruling parties and the opposition parties are making moves. Now, Doctor, I finally want to end on this one. Now, the entire media headlines have been host to a myriad of speculations. Some say that the lira's value has stabilized. Others insist that there is really nothing stopping the lira's devaluation at this point. So the currency could even be trading at half the value next month. Now, can I get your opinion on how dire the situation is really?
It is exactly the way that you described, because the issue of the currency is not looking at the problems of the currency. They are basically saying, let it fall. That's the central bank's approach, let it fall. I don't care. As a result, Turkish lira goes down further and further. So there is no anchor that's holding the value of lira. So if the central bank says, I'm not going to lower the interest rate any further, this is enough, and so there's no such thing. And after their last meeting, they claimed that there is another 100 basis point difference. I mean, they didn't say it 100 basis point, but we know that will go down to around 14%, likely to go to 14% policy rate. That's why Turkish lira is now moving to above 11. Maybe in 10 days, within 8 days, it moved from 10 to 11. The value of dollar against lira. So why not within 5 days it moved from 11 to 12? There is no reason. There is no explanation from the government to stop this. This is bleeding. It is basically lira is losing value, and our government is just watching it.
I see, sir. Well, folks, you heard it here. There are unfortunately no brakes on this train. Dr. Yılmaz, thank you for your analysis and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tursan.
Our pleasure, sir. Continuing on with domestic news, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is ramping up for election season, but employing a never-seen-before strategy, admitting fault and asking for reconciliation. Now, typically, politicians do not admit fault. They just blame the guy from across the aisle. But Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu makes a bold play and turns convention on its head. On a video he released on his Twitter account, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu declared that his party was responsible for many scandals and atrocities, and that it was time to admit fault and atone for the wrongdoings.
Opposition leaders' call for making amends sparks discussion on Turkey's historical wrongdoings and current polarization. In a video released on Saturday on social media, CHP chairman Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu made a sweeping call for making of amends and reconciliation, seemingly aimed at addressing Turkey's historical wrongdoings and mending divides in the deeply polarized country. Acknowledging that his own party, the CHP, had made mistakes in the past. In my lifetime, I have seen love and hate in our country. Now, I want love to win. Our country needs to heal. Making amends will not change the past, but can save the future. In his 4.5-minute video, Kılıçdaroğlu argued that a simple change of power in Ankara would not be enough to heal the country's divide, and mentioned that he wanted to leave a positive legacy for the country. In the days following the release of his video, Kılıçdaroğlu listed specific events to atone for, including the 1955 pogrom against Greek residents of Istanbul, the brutal torture of inmates at Diyarbakır's notorious prison following the 1980 coup, the 2011 Roboski massacre, the infamous 2014 Soma mine cave-in, and Turkey's 1997 postmodern coup, which forced the dissolution of the Islamist Welfare Party.
Türkiye'nin terörle mücadelesini
Ömer Çelik, spokesperson for President Erdogan's party AKP, released a response to Kılıçdaroğlu's video on Monday. Çelik said calls for making amends are admirable, but how are you going to see this through? Casting doubt on the notion that reconciliation is possible. His full statement suggested that Kılıçdaroğlu's call for reconciliation was detached from the political and historical realities present in Turkey. Gearing up for election, Kılıçdaroğlu and İYİ Party chair Meral Akşener held a joint press conference on Wednesday and called for early elections. The opposition had long pressed the ruling party for early elections in an effort to capitalize on the falling popularity of President Erdogan.
Our next story, we don't have a video for due to copyright reasons, but just as well because we don't really want to give too much away this time. The 2021 Turkish period drama on Netflix, The Club, is taking the world by storm. The Club portrays Matilda, an ex-convict who's freed due to a mass pardon and tries to find her way in 1955's Istanbul and tries to reconnect with her daughter the meanwhile. Like I said, we don't want to give too much away, but what we can say for sure is that the series showcases a struggle of ethnic and religious minorities in mid-century Istanbul. Joining me now to do a deep dive on the show, columnist Kenan Sharpe. Mr. Sharpe, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely, sir. Pleasure's all ours. Now, as you wrote in your article, which we will have down in the description so folks can read it themselves, as you wrote in the article, very little is known about the Jewish community in Turkey. I myself was surprised at how little I was aware of their language, customs, and history. Now, the series introduces us to the mid-century lives of Sephardi Jews, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Could you please tell us a little bit about who the Sephardi Jews are?
Absolutely. So you're not the only one who doesn't know too much about the Sephardi Jews. There's actually a wonderful moment in the series where our main character, Matilda, is talking to a young Muslim boy who recently migrated from the village, and a folk song is playing, and the Muslim boy asks Matilda what the song is, and she says it's an old Sephardic song. And he says, "What is Sephardic?" And she explains to him then that it's the Jews from Iberia, from Spain and Portugal, who migrated to the Ottoman Empire about 500 years ago. So this is a community of Jews from, like I said, what is today Spain and Portugal. And the Sephardim are the second biggest group of Jews after the Ashkenazim, who are the Jews from Central Europe, like Poland, Germany, Russia, places like that. And it's a really interesting story of how the Sephardim ended up in what is today Turkey. They lived under Arab rule in medieval Andalusia, but they were expelled in the 15th century during a period called the Reconquest, when a Catholic king and queen took over the kingdom, and they expelled both the Muslims and the Jews from Spain and from Portugal. So a long period of migration, mass conversion, and execution began, and over 100,000 people were expelled, and many of them came to North Africa, and many more came to the Ottoman Empire, where they were given refuge by Sultan Bayezid II, brought in many cases by the Ottoman Navy to cities like Istanbul and Thessaloniki, Sarajevo, even more inland, like on the west, Bursa and Aydin, and then also on the Mediterranean coast, like Jerusalem, Damascus, Egypt, places like that. And interestingly, when they came, they also brought with them their language. So the Sephardic Jews spoke different dialects of medieval Spanish, a language called Ladino, also known as Judeo-Spanish. And over centuries of living in the Ottoman Empire, it began to be mixed with Turkish words. It already had a lot of Hebrew in it. So this is a community very much who brought their roots with them when they had to leave Spain. And it was a quite populous community as well. By the start of the 20th century, the end of the Ottoman Empire, there were roughly 200,000 Sephardic Jews in Turkey. And today, by contrast, in 2021, there were only around 14,000. And like other minorities in Turkey, the Sephardic Jews also had a difficult time, to say the least, in this long period of state building and trying to create a more homogenous nation state. So there were different periods of pogroms, legal discrimination, acts of popular violence, etc., that has made the population much smaller today, including more recently terrorist attacks against synagogues in 2003 and other times. But today, sadly, the vast majority of Turkish Jews live actually in Israel and no longer in Turkey.
I see. Now, segueing a little bit now, as you mentioned in your article, as a Turkish audience, we're not used to seeing series that handle ethnic minorities. We feel more at home with series like The Valley of the Wolves, very famous here in Turkey, where it serves a more nationalistic, more macho, and frankly, a more anti-Semitic narrative, where we have series that focuses on ethnic minorities and their struggles. That's very rare. Now, At the end of the day, filmmaking is a business, and really nobody is going to pay to air your work if they stand to lose money doing it. If that's what the audience wants, that's what you got to give the audience. But Netflix didn't lose money at all. As a matter of fact, the show is wildly popular, both here and abroad. Now, could you speculate on why the series is as successful as it is, while being such a departure from the norm?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a great question because on the one hand, it's quite politically bold in terms of the content of the show. But I think one reason it's successful is that while the content is political and strong, stylistically, it's quite traditional. It gives the viewer kind of what they expect. So it's interesting to note that the creator and the director of most of the episodes is a woman named Zeynep Günay Tan, who is actually a very successful director of soap operas and television series. Everyone knows the kind of Turkish dizi sector, which is big not only in Turkey, but all over the world. But Günay Tan has actually directed some of the most quality of these kind of mainstream network shows, series like İstanbul Gelin, The Bride from Istanbul, different stories of lovers being ripped apart, long scenes of lovers gazing into each other's eyes, and all this kind of stuff. And this show, Club, is actually her first digital series. And it keeps some of the melodramatic style and the love narratives. But like you said, the main characters are not Turkish Muslims, not the majority in Turkey, but these Sephardic Jews from Istanbul. And it very much is not a community we're used to seeing portrayed in film or television in Turkey. There's been some stories about Greeks and Armenians, and some of them discuss massacres, discrimination, pogroms, etc. But the only Jews we've really seen on screen in Turkey are not much more than anti-Semitic stereotypes. You get rich, greedy bankers who are plotting to undermine Turkey with its enemies, or you get spies or Mossad agents and stuff like that. But what the club gives us instead, I think, is a really humane portrayal of the everyday experiences of Istanbul, the Istanbul Jewish community in the 1950s. Really radically, we hear them speaking in Ladino, that medieval dialect of Spanish mixed with Hebrew and Turkish, and living in what was once a heavily Jewish neighborhood and now a very touristic neighborhood near the Galata Tower in Beyoğlu. And these are working class characters. We see their real problems, their loves, their heartbreaks. But we also see the struggles they go through as a minority community in a country that has historically often been really hostile to its minorities. And so the series is radical in that it makes us identify with them. But then, like you said, the show still earns money and is still popular. It's still popular because it doesn't do this in an overly heavy-handed way. It really makes us love the characters and feel with them. And I think one more thing of why the show is so popular in Turkey especially is people are very nostalgic about the old days, and especially about the area around Taksim and Beyoğlu, which was once famously where, had all these chic shops and people dressed very fancily. And there's this kind of nostalgia for this multicultural past. And the show gives you that with these wonderful recreations of 1950s Beyoğlu, but it does it without watering down that bitter history that has made it so that so few people in Turkey today really know much about this community at all.
I see, sir. Now, if you don't mind, I do want to circle back to that bitter history that you were talking about. Now, the series examines an important historical point in Turkey, namely the wealth tax disaster, where the government allegedly targeted non-Muslims, bourgeoisie class, who were sent to work camps where dozens met their end and perished. I myself am ashamed to say that I was not wholly familiar with this key point in history. Now, could you please expand on these historic events a little bit so our audience is somewhat familiar?
Absolutely. And I should say, first of all, that you're not the only one who's not very familiar with these events, because they're not taught in school, for example, here. A lot of people will learn about it, if they learned about it at all, much later. And in fact, one of the architects of this really brutal wealth tax, Şükrü Saracoğlu, is still commemorated with the name of a stadium in Istanbul. Mm-hmm. So it's a history that really should be talked about. And to understand what the wealth tax is, you have to understand Turkey's role in the Second World War. So, of course, Turkey remained neutral, but it maintained strong diplomatic ties with Nazi Germany. And there were some factions in the government who wanted to be even closer with Nazi Germany. And during the war, Turkey actually denaturalized thousands of Jews living abroad. And between 2,200 and 2,500 Turkish Jews were actually deported to extermination camps like Auschwitz, which is also something not well known. And the wealth tax should be seen in this context of the war in Nazi Germany. It was a tax or a capital tax mostly levied on non-Muslim citizens in Turkey. So the ostensible reason for it was to raise funds for Turkey's defense if it ended up joining the war. And it was proposed to the Turkish parliament by, again, Şükrü Saracoğlu's government and adopted on November 11th, 1942. And while, again, the ostensible reason was to raise money for defense, what its effect was, and we see in documents that its really intention was to ruin financially non-Muslim citizens in the country, to end their prominence in business and to transfer their assets to non-Muslims, so as to make a Muslim bourgeoisie class. So while on the surface the tax said it discriminated against everyone the same, scholarship and people's experiences show that non-Muslims were taxed up to 10 times more heavily than Muslims, and their wealth and property were transferred to Muslim Turks. So the effect of this is that the remaining non-Muslim merchant class was basically destroyed. The lives and finances of non-Muslims, including Jews, Armenians, Greeks, were ruined, and sometimes the tax that was demanded was several times higher than a person's entire wealth. And it was not just major business people, et cetera, who were affected by the tax, but non-Muslim drivers, workers, beggars were also obliged to pay these taxes while their Muslim counterparts were not. And for people who could not pay their taxes or who were accused, falsely or not, of withholding them, were sent to work camps in eastern Anatolia. And 21 people died in these camps, and their wealth was then sold in auctions at extremely low prices to Turkish Muslims, which actually paved the way for some of the wealthy families and conglomerates that are very influential in Turkey today. And we see this portrayed in the show, whereas our main character's father and brother are sent to the camps and the family loses all its wealth. And one really powerful moment in the show is when our main character goes to the house of a Muslim coworker and hears a cuckoo bird watch and recognizes the sounding of the watch and realizes that it's something that was either stolen from their apartment during the wealth tax or sold at a very cheap price. And as a result of this historical event, the wealth tax and others, around 30,000 Jews left for Israel after the wealth tax, not for ideological reasons, but because they had a sense they were unwanted and could no longer survive in Turkey.
I see, sir. And finally, let's end on the crux, rather. You allude in your article that the show is, in essence, a historical recap of Istanbul's minorities being pushed out by a Muslim majority. And I do believe that I got that right. And a tale of oppression and discrimination, where really the only refuge the minorities have are the tiny enclaves of Istanbul's Beyoğlu district and nightclubs. I believe we see a duality where the Muslims need the non-Muslims to work in the clubs because Muslims won't do the work. But at the same time, they try their very best to push them out of society entirely. Would you call that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's what the series shows us. So, of course, there were different neighborhoods in Istanbul that had, strong minority presences like Yeniköy, Kadıköy, Beşiktaş, Şişli, Bakırköy. But of course, the most famous and the most iconic is the Beyoğlu district. And it has a long history from being a Genoese colony and bringing in diplomats and foreign Christians to being an area where many non-Muslims would settle and thrive. And because it was sort of away from the historic peninsula and under the shadow of Topkapı Palace, it's also where drinking establishments were. Restaurants in the 19th century, you have chic shops and the kind of French style of fashionable people, et cetera. And of course, the nightlife, the bars, the clubs, and everything else, which were really strongly either owned by non-Muslims or worked at by non-Muslims. So what happens in the 1950s, which the show really powerfully portrays, is that there was a process of Turkification after the wealth had been taken from so many Muslims through the wealth tax. The kind of last standing fortress was the nightlife in Beyoğlu. And the show, again, for a kind of melodramatic story in some ways, really powerfully shows these events that are not often discussed. So we have a character, Orhan, who is a successful businessman who runs the club that gives the show its name. And his employees, from the light technicians to the dancers to the laundry women to the cooks, are mostly Greek, Armenian, and Jewish. And they're also, because the sector was mostly either run or worked in by non-Muslims, they're the most skilled in these roles. But what happens is the character is given an ultimatum by a consortium of Turkish businessmen saying, we want to give you an award as a successful Turkish entrepreneur. But to do that, we want you to see that you only hire Turks. So the owner makes a list and starts kicking out the non-Muslims that work in his club. But we also see the result of this. So, for example, an Armenian light technician who runs the lights for the stage, for dance performances and singing, a man named Agop Usta. His job is given to a recently migrated Anatolian Muslim from the village. And of course, he doesn't have the skill, he doesn't have the experience, and the show is a disaster. So these are the most skilled people in the sector, and they were slowly kicked out in this process of Turkification. There's some interesting stuff with this character of Orhan himself, but I don't want to give you spoilers. But let me just say that we still have a kind of memory of the nightlife and entertainment sector having a really strong non-Muslim presence. So, for example, there's this kind of stereotypical nostalgic character of the Greek bartender. And even today, some people, when they drink rakı, they will listen to certain Greek music. But there's very few Greeks, one left in Turkey and second in the sector. And as for the Jews, we're almost not aware of them at all. And this community, though small, still exists proudly in Turkey. And I think what this Netflix series does, it gives us a chance to know them better and a chance to stand with them, hopefully in solidarity.
I see. Mr. Sharpe, thank you for making the time to join us today, and thank you for your assessment. And for the folks at home, that show again is on Netflix right now, The Club. And it's worth a look. Mr. Sharpe, thank you again, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And with that, that's it for us on This Week in Turkey. I have been Murat Tursan, and thank you for joining us.
Türkiye'nin sivil, bağımsız, özgür ve çoğulcu bir medya ortamına ihtiyacı var. Medyascope, 20 Ağustos 2015'te bu ihtiyacı karşılamak üzere yola çıktı. Ama yolumuz uzun. Bu yolculukta bize Patreon veya YouTube'un katıl butonu üzerinden katkıda bulunabilirsiniz. Destek verin, sizinle güçlenelim.